Greetings. My name is Tyler. I'm a bookseller from San Antonio, Texas. Sell on eBay as well as a store here in San Antonio, Texas, located at Blue Star Arts Complex. Recently, I got a hold of a lot of Ballantine Adult Fantasy from the 70s. It's a great lot to introduce myself to the world of fantasy. I haven't delved too deeply into vintage fantasy or contemporary for that matter. My background is mostly in anthropology, philosophy, and esoterica, and that is where the bulk of my reselling and buying went to in the past. But every year I like to learn a little more about something a little outside of our wheelhouse, and recently I've been finding myself falling in love with vintage sci-fi and fantasy, especially new wave sci-fi, things with great covers, interesting plots, beautiful prose, the likes of Jack Vance, Ursula K. Le Guin, Clark Ashton Smith, and speaking of which, I was able to get a few of Clark Ashton Smith's books in this lot. I haven't actually been able to read any of the books yet in the lot except for one, and that book was probably the intro to the series. It's called Imaginary Worlds by Lynn Carter. Lynn Carter was the editor of this series. He was famous for his work as an editor. However, he also wrote, I wouldn't call them amazing works of fantasy. I think they are mostly of mixed reviews. He was known mostly as a stylistic copier of his contemporaries and people who came before him. He wrote books in the style of Robert E. Howard, the author of the Conan novels and stories. He says he's the first person up to this point who had done a complete overview of the fantasy genre. It was popularized and brought to the public by Tolkien. And it's funny, in this book, he really spends a lot of time on Tolkien. Doesn't seem to have much of a love of Tolkien as many people do today. Lynn Carter was probably someone who read so much of the world and the history of fantasy that he really was able to map out Tolkien's influences. He says that it is subjective who would be the best. And in this book, he says, yes, he would technically be the best. However, he does give the title of the greatest or the best fantasy author to other authors throughout the book, such as Lord Dunsany. He also says T.H. White's book, The Once Future King, to be the best book of fantasy ever written. However, in this book, Imaginary Worlds, he, I believe, is the first and does a great job of centering his work, his thesis, to be the realm of works of fiction that are completely imagined in their world building, not based on a historical place, not based on a world that existed in the past or a contemporary world with imagined characters, but a completely imaginary world. So that is one of the overall themes of the book. And I think it's interesting. It's the first time I ever really thought about it as a topic that requires explanation. And I think that was probably one of Lin Carter's unsung theories. One of the things that he pinpointed that I think is due for a lot of recognition. The imaginary worlds doesn't necessarily require a genre, but it is something that does and should be delineated throughout people's works. Lin Carter mostly wrote in the realm of sword and sorcery. He does a lot of work in this book to defend the genre as something that doesn't really need to evolve outside of the confines of sword and sorcery. People like to read it, people like to write it, and uses science fiction and its constant social commentary as an example of something that sword and sorcery doesn't need to do. It's in a completely imagined world. And unlike science fiction, it doesn't need to have to reference the world we live in with some sort of commentary, some sort of issue that is gone to its logical or realistic end to try to see some sort of unknown outcome. It basically doesn't need to change or evolve too much. And I do think there's something interesting in this premise. How creative can an author be in a completely imagined world? How much can the genre truly evolve within the limits that it's set for itself? I think that this series especially lays the foundation for the wider audience in the 70s to really understand the great masterworks of fantasy. So Lin Carter did a great job in editing the series. He did a pretty cool job, I would say, at making a comprehensive overview of the masters of the past in this book. And he does a pretty interesting job as well. I'm using interesting because it was, I'm not a writer, so his job of giving ideas or examples of what not to do in writing fantasy, how to write fantasy in this book, was probably the second half of this book or the last third of this book, how to write fantasy. He does a lot of pointing out in other authors what not to do. He has a whole chapter on how to make names for fantasy locations, for characters. It was hard to read towards the end because it just became, well, here's a bunch of names that are bad and they don't reflect what the character's personality or what their inherent values would be. And here's a lot of names that are good, and it truly does reflect and does a great job. He says Dunsany is probably the most amazing fantasy namer, the person who gave lyrical, poetic names to his places and things. It became a lot of tips on how to create a world that was realistic, that wouldn't bring the reader out of the dream or the sense of the fantastic, cast a spell over them in a way that makes them think that this fantasy could actually be real. So the tips that he gives for world making, I think, are valuable. They're worth reading if you're a fantasy author. A lot of this, from what I've heard, isn't exactly fully accurate, so take it with a grain of salt. So excited to dive in to some of these books. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you what I have for now and leave it at that. Perhaps a more in-depth review of imaginary worlds is in order. However, I do think that it's something that if you're interested in writing and reading fantasy, you should pick up and just have on your shelf for further reference. There's some great material in the back for autobiographies, biographies, books by the authors he puts in here that if you're a lover of fantasy would probably be interesting or valuable. Here's some other books by Lynn Carter that were in the series. New Worlds for Old. This is a poetry book that he edited. Some of the names in here are Clark Ashton Smith, translating William Beckford, the author of Vathek, Edgar Allan Poe, George MacDonald, Oscar Wilde, Lord Dunsany, H.P. Lovecraft, Gary Myers, George Sterling, with the entire of the poem Wine of Wizardry in here, which was a huge influence on Clark Ashton Smith. I believe also this one contains The Hashish Eater, which was Clark Ashton Smith's epic poem. C.L. Moore, Robert E. Howard. Yeah, a great place to start if you want to read some of the great poets of this genre. This is The Young Magicians. Short stories by fantasy authors William Morris, Lord Dunsany, E.R. Eddison, Cabell, Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith again, Lynn Carter himself, A. Merritt, Robert E. Howard, Henry Kuttner, Jack Vance, C.S. Lewis, and Tolkien. Very cool. Lately, I've only been getting into the short stories in this genre. Clark Ashton Smith and Lord Dunsany mostly. They've just been so fun to read before bed, to kind of inoculate my mind into their worlds, into their style of thinking. I love the Dungeness and Gothic darkness of that time, and the cultural way they world build. As an anthropology student, I just think that they were the masters of making a believable, almost ethnographic feel. This is another one I picked up called The Great Short Novels of Adult Fantasy, Volume 2. This one's got the likes of George MacDonald, Chambers, Robert Chambers, Ernest Brema, and Eden Philpotts. I haven't heard of these authors, but except for George MacDonald. And look at that cover. So cool. I'm really excited to get into these short novels. A Lost World novel, The Lost Continent, by Hine. Novel about Atlantis. The 4 books by William Morris. So William Morris, he says in Imaginary Worlds, is the originator of the fantasy genre of Imaginary Worlds. He says this book, Beyond the Wood of the Worlds, is the first fully imagined world that was written for the fantasy genre. Perhaps not the first fantasy book ever written. He cites books like Vathek to be among the first, and George MacDonald's books to be among the first, but those existed in real places. This book, he says, is the first fully imagined world. And I'm so excited to get into William Morris. He seemed like such a Renaissance man, a real business person, an artist, a craftsman. He created Renaissance style art and crafts such as furniture and wallpaper. For me, I think that William Morris is almost the patron saint of this project I'm doing, to read fantasy, to really wallpaper my mind with these images and these themes and these feelings so that I can fully immerse myself in this escapist realm, or truly so that I can dream in this style. This is the Well at World's End, Volume 1 and 2. And The Sundering Flood. I believe these were all 4 of William Morris's books in this series. And another Lost Continent novel is The People of the Mist. Some of these next ones are my candidates for the next book I read in these series. A Voyage to Arcturus, weird fantasy, almost in the realm of sci-fi. I've heard a lot of great things about this. Travels to other planets, psychedelic world building, new colors that are only described, just amazing ideas and techniques. Loot in the Mist, Hope Mirrlees, another great essential work of fantasy that I think was actually repopularized by this series. Probably the only time it was reprinted since its original printing. Probably the next book I read, The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. His prose is just so beautiful. It's magnificent. I've heard many people say that this is their most favorite book of all time, and I'm so excited to get into it. Here's a book I found before ordering the lot at a local bookstore. It's Titus Grown. They say this book is totally underrated, also very dark and medieval feeling. It takes place entirely in a single castle and centers around a young child named Titus and how all of the characters around him interact. It's one of those slow-moving, slow-burning novels that I hear is just criminally underrated. This is The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle and A Fine and Private Place. Wow, the backs of these are really cool as well. The Last Unicorn. I believe many of these book covers were the paintings of, I believe his name is Gervais Gallardo, and Centipede Press should be releasing a art book of his work soon, and I hope I can get one. I know those books sell out very quickly. Probably the grails of this lot were the 2 Clark Ashton Smith books, Zothique and Hyperborea. Currently, I've been reading Hyperborea. I haven't really delved into his other realms that he's created, but I have read this book here, The City of the Singing Flame. This isn't in the Ballantine Adult Fantasy series. These are in the Timescape series. These are some of the only times that Clark Ashton Smith has been republished in the paperback format. I got these as a lot as well. These are very valuable. I think they're going to be even more sought after in the future as Clark Ashton Smith becomes more and more of a household name. It's just that his short stories, unlike Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, weren't easy to publish. As I understand it, they weren't easy to compile as a fully thought out novel. And if you try to find the complete works of Clark Ashton Smith, especially in hardback form, they can go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So something like this Hyperborea is a complete collection of his Hyperborea world. And then Zothique would be another world. I believe it takes place on Saturn. But as I've been reading his works, I've had to, and I think anyone would probably have to do this, is create a list of new vocabulary. Clark Ashton Smith was a self-educated man who lived in Auburn, California. There's a great documentary of him called The Emperor of Dreams that came out that I was able to watch, and it was so fascinating understanding his life. He was basically a hermit, lived all the way up until his 60s without running water, without electricity. People like H.P. Lovecraft were his fan, and they knew that they would never be able to write poetry as well as he did. So his work is extremely poetic. It's full of just rare, dated words that aren't in the style of like some sort of Victorian book like Orlando Furioso that I'm going to show you soon, but you will have to pinpoint individual words to fully understand what he's saying or to get the complete picture. But it is accessible because it's only short stories. The City of the Singing Flame was said to be a story about him and Lovecraft. It's just fantastic. I'm not going to spoil it, but you can definitely find it online and read it. It's about some writers who find a portal to another world inside their park that they live near in California. It's a short story collection by Lord Dunsany, At the Edge of the World. And this comes from a lot of different Dunsany books. Dreamer's Tales, The Last Book of Wonder. This has just been one of the most fascinating books that I've been able to read lately. A short story that really stood out to me was the Men of Yarnith, and how they worship this god that is a statue in the side of the mountain that they basically implore to fix all of their problems in life until a plague hits and the god is not able to help them anymore. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath by H.P. Lovecraft. One of his only forays into a more traditional style of fantasy. Probably why Lynn Carter chose this rather than any of his like Cthulhu Mythos novels. He says it's one of his greatest works. And I'm going to go ahead and trust Lynn Carter's judgment on a lot of this stuff. There was a whole chapter in Imaginary Worlds that he talked about the contemporary authors of his time and how they were truly coming up and could be some of the greats. And amongst them, he definitely referenced Ursula K. Le Guin, who, as you probably know, is one of the greats, amongst many others. So I'm going to get into the last half of these books fairly quickly, starting with The Worm of Ouroboros by E.R. Eddison. He says this is probably the greatest imagined world fantasy that was ever written. Even though The Once Future King tops that as greatest fantasy, not an imagined world. So he gives that title to this, The Worm of Ouroboros, as the single book that is the greatest. However, the next two books in the series, the Mistress of Mistresses and the Fish Dinner and Memison, can't compare to the first. He definitely included all three in the series of adult fantasy. I believe there is a fourth. I cannot exactly remember. All right, some William Hope Hodgson. The Nightland. I got these separately at a estate sale that I went to recently, and they did have a copy of The House in the Borderland, but I have read that book. I read it in my teens, and I just loved it, and I should have went on to actually find a copy of it. I had to read it as an ebook, but the Nightland, I believe, is his magnum opus, his most masterful piece, rather. In the lot, I found The Boats of the Glencarrig by William Hope Hodgson. The Evangeline Walton tetralogy. This was a series of books based on the Mabinogion of Welsh mythology. I've heard a lot of great things about this, being one of the finest works in this collection. And I also hear that it was unfinished before Lynn Carter actually ordered the completion of the series by Evangeline Walton 30 years after she published the first. So thanks to Lynn Carter, thanks to this series, we have the full completion of the Mabinogion tetralogy. I don't know much about this book. This is The World's Desire. All I know is it has one of the coolest covers. However, I found this at the estate sale and it's got some damage, so that's definitely going to be a reading copy for me. The Merlin's Ring by Munn. Orlando Furioso. Two books by Cabell, Silver Stallion and The High Place. Many of these books, including these Cabell books, I've sold before individually on eBay. The reason I want to read these books, the reason I want to get into fantasy, is legitimately, I think, valid and true for a lot of readers of fantasy. I'm trying to escape constantly putting these negative thoughts of a alternate future where mankind has been destroyed or on some precipice of destruction. I'm trying to wallpaper my mind with a world I'd love to live in. Something I want you as a viewer of this or as a lover of fantasy, comment in the section below, comment in the comment section, what fantasy book or science fiction book would you actually love to live in? What world would you not mind actually spending your lifetime in? Think about it. And how many books can you say that you've read you would actually like to be a character in? Once I thought about this, I actually completely flipped my my thinking. I was reading fantasy by Tanith Lee, who's one of my favorite authors, and I was thinking, what would I actually want to live in this Flat Earth series? Would I actually want to live in a world where there's a demon king that's doing all of these taboo and evil things to humans? I don't think so. Even though the book was amazing, that's the reason I actually picked this series up, so that I could feel something that was different than that. This is the Fletcher Pratt duo, the Land of Unreason and the Blue Star. Hannes Bach duo, the Sorcerer's Ship, and Beyond the Golden Star. Merlin's Godson by Munn, The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson, The Enchanted Pilgrimage by Simek, and lastly, Hero's Journey and The Unforsaken Hero. This is by Lineage. And I have an extra copy of Imaginary Worlds. I'll probably be able to sell one, but the rest of the series, I'm only going to sell my duplicates and try to complete this series. Thanks so much for watching. Leave in the comments what imaginary world or what fantasy novel you would like to live in. I'm genuinely curious about this topic. If there was a world that you could live in fully as a character or fully just as a person, which would you decide? Is there a dystopian or world at war novel that you would actually want to live in? Perhaps there's some I would want to live in, but the realm of fantasy is where my mind goes first, and that's the reason I picked these books up, so I could engage with these thoughts. Thanks so much. There's a big book sale, a haul that I am about to show y'all, and I'm still working on culling out the fat and selling to local bookstores, putting on eBay, and you can follow me on Instagram as well. I'll put the links in the bio. It's been really cool. This is my first video for y'all. Hopefully there's some recommendations or something you can gain from this. Tell me what you think. Thanks so much.